All right. Thank you very much. I think you can all hear me. Thanks for sticking with us through the day. We're probably going to use most of the time today, myself and Paul from AWS, going into VMware Cloud and AWS. We can stay here afterwards for questions, or even better, we can go and grab a beer in the other room and have some questions and answers there. Our answers will be far more exciting with a beer in hand, I'm sure. So just to skip, I need to flip over the presentation there. Just so I know who's in the room. For those of you who are currently using VMware in some way, can you raise your hands for me? Okay, everyone, pretty much. Those of you who are currently using AWS today, can you raise your hands, please? Okay, a little bit less. All right, that's actually a good mix for what we had prepared for you as well. So I've been doing this sort of conversation across Canada. My role is I lead the technical teams for VMware across the country. And I've had an opportunity to talk to a lot of people, but also I've been doing a lot of research around digital transformation in Canada and specifically around hybrid cloud adoption in Canada. And I want to start there, actually. The clicker will work. Might need, is it right arrow on this one? Yeah, you're good. All right, there we go. So this is one of the things I found in my research that made me go, what's the deal with this? So this was a study from Dell Technologies that highlighted which countries and which verticals are doing better in transformation and cloud adoption, and which ones are least mature, not doing so well. And I saw a bunch that are relevant to what I do every day here in Canada. Canada, as a country, being low on that benchmark. Insurance, as one of the major industries in Canada, low on that benchmark. And public healthcare being one of our big industries here as well, being low. So I really started my thinking around, well, why is that? And what can we do about it as a group? Because all of us are here trying to solve problems for the people that we serve. And so I started to go back and look at, what's the history of cloud and cloud adoption in Canada. Around 2011 is when really a lot of people started digging in on cloud and putting together a cloud strategy. You might have gotten your first cloud-first mandate from a CIO level at that point. And most Canadian organizations started to wonder, okay, this is what my strategy looks like. And then at some point, legal came to you and said, you know what? Can't do that because there's just too many privacy concerns working with cloud the way it is currently. And so in 2011, most Canadian organizations, public and private sector, hit the brakes a little bit and said, we're gonna slow down, we're gonna actually hold off for now on cloud. Fast forward 5 years, and that's when some of the cloud providers started setting up shop in Canada, AWS being one of the big ones here. But in 2016, organizations said, okay, now I can start to think about cloud again. And so most people went back to that strategy that they had started with, took it off the shelf, maybe brushed some of the dust off of it to see how am I going to get back on this cloud thing. But something else happened in 2016 that would suggest you shouldn't do that. Because in 2016, this was the reality of the market in Canada. If you look at new applications that people were purchasing, the vast majority, still traditional 3-tiered applications. And if you look at everything that's existing in a data center in 2016, 90% traditional applications, 10% cloud-native applications. And so if you're one of the big cloud providers that's looking to set up, do you say, hey, I want access to 10% of the market? Or do you say, hey, maybe I should partner with the people who have a lock on that traditional application market? And that's exactly what happened. And in 2016, VMware and AWS announced this partnership, which effectively, and we're going to talk in way more detail, but effectively allows you to put together a cloud strategy that looks at 100% of what you're doing in your environment and say, what's my strategy going to be to take a look at everything that I do and build a new strategy based on that. And if you look at more Canadian stats, as we get into 2017, you saw the Canadian mindset start to shift towards hybrid cloud as well. And I know you can't see the details on here necessarily, but In 2016, people were thinking, I've got all these different silos I've got to manage. I've got this cloud here, I've got this application here, I've got a bunch of different things. I'm going to have a strategy around that. In 2017, the big blue bar there, 67%, says, I'm now thinking of a hybrid strategy where I have one approach to how I manage my infrastructure and my applications, regardless of whether it's in my private cloud or my public cloud. It's going to move across both, manage my applications and my processes in the same way. So that's the shift. And that's frankly when I started to have a lot of conversations with Canadian organizations about hybrid cloud strategies that are inclusive of everything that you're doing on premise and the things you want to be doing as net new cloud native applications. But there's one other thing that we have to consider as Canadians, and that's the fact that we are under a different set of rules and regulations than our friends in the rest of the world. And just as an example, this is only the last few months of some of the compliance changes that have impacted Canadian IT. So on the far left there, you see the Cloud Act. And the Cloud Act is something that was put in as part of a US budget bill that essentially sets up a data extradition treaty between the US and other governments, potentially including Canada, right? So that's something that you're going to have to think about once that gets enacted. NAFTA 2.0, USMCA, announced about 2 weeks ago, not ratified yet. But included in USMCA is, I'll use an example that we probably all understand. It says you can't put in a Buy Canadian clause. So that makes sense. If you can't say you must buy Canadian steel, that's not allowed in USMCA. I think that makes sense to most people. Also included in USMCA is you must not say data needs to reside in Canada. So that's something new we've got to figure out. That's actually different than the laws that they have in British Columbia and Nova Scotia, and different than a lot of the policies you're working with. Intention here isn't to tell you need to become an expert on this, but to understand that there's a lot of things that are going on that affect us. And then the last one, in 2 days, Digital Privacy Act goes into effect, where mandatory reporting comes into effect across Canada. So how do we manage against that policy and make sure we comply with that policy? The intention here isn't to say you need to be a lawyer, you need to incorporate all of this into your cloud strategy. The intention is to say when you're putting together a cloud strategy, look to one that gives you portability. Portability that says, I can take this application, I can put it here when it makes sense. Say the classification on that workload changes, I can move it here. Say something else changes, I need to bring it back. That's the sort of flexibility that I think a Canadian cloud strategy needs to have. And so I pulled this down yesterday. You probably, everybody know this person in the room? Raise your hand. Actually only a handful, okay. Alex is the CIO, Treasury Board, setting policy for Canadian government. And this was part of a new book launch that he did on digital government. The public sector needs to think bigger and act quicker. In the startup community, a good deal of emphasis is placed on time to market. Similar thinking must now be adopted by governments. And I will say, as both a professional in the IT industry and as a taxpayer in Canada, I agree with that statement, right? But I also recognize there's a reality. We have all these existing applications. We have these compliance requirements. We have security requirements. Sometimes it feels like those things can be at odds, right? Be quick, faster time to market, but also be secure, also have great uptime, those sorts of things. So how do you work in that sort of environment? And I'm going to dig in a little bit to the challenge first, and then I'm going to come back and tell you what I believe the solution is. And spoiler alert, I think that actually everything we've done so far puts us in a position to leapfrog ahead of some of the other nations who had to figure all these things out back in 2011, because we are starting on this journey with a much bigger toolbox. And so we have a lot of things we can do. But this is, whether you're private sector or public sector, this is a reality of what you're dealing with today, right? You've got two currencies, essentially. You've got time, and time is time to market, or how long it's going to take me to do something, or how long I have on that particular procurement vehicle. And you've got money, and that is the annual budget cycle you get that changes based on which government comes in. But these are really the two currencies you have to spend as you're trying to deliver more citizen services. And so do you spend that limited currency, whether it be time or money, on improving the services that you're delivering to your citizens? Or do you spend it on re-platforming everything you have in order to reduce the costs that you have in your organization? And this is just the reality of probably some of the conversations you have as you're doing your project planning, priorities with some of your DMs, figuring out what do I do with this limited currency. And here's the challenge behind that, right? If you are running, let's say those stats are correct, 90% of your data center are traditional 3-tiered applications. You're running them in a private data center somewhere here in Ottawa or within the Government of Canada, and there we go, just got to build this out. That application, a 3-tiered application, has a dependency on the network. It's expecting that there's network connectivity there, that there's firewalls doing their things, load balancers are doing their thing, and the application doesn't have to worry about that because the network takes care of that. Similar from a compute perspective, all the logic is living on the server, but it's dependent on the other things that are happening in the environment as well. And then the application state, everything about where that application is, what's been saved, it really depends on the storage layer as well. And again, the application is not resilient enough to understand that maybe that storage goes away. It expects the storage to be there, it expects the storage to be performant, and these are the three things that come together to make a traditional application work. This isn't necessarily true in the cloud native world, but it is absolutely true in the traditional application world. And so most everyone in this room, especially if you raised your hand on the VMware side of things, you understand. You virtualize that compute layer, and it gives you portability. If one server goes down, you can move it to another server. If one server's end of life, you can move that application somewhere else. That just works. And the reason it works is because you're within that data center that has the same storage and same networks that those applications depend on. So you can move things around, no problem. So you've probably been asked the question, all right, well, why don't I just move out of that data center altogether, move it to the cloud, or move to an SSE data center, or any number of different workload migration scenarios you might have been put up with. Well, you could move that, theoretically. You can move the application and the virtual machine that it's on. But then when it comes to the other things that it depends on, you've probably got some big blinky boxes somewhere that those things are dependent on. And so it becomes really difficult. And then this turns into your re-platforming project that just ate up all of next year's budget, right? On spending to re-platform. And that's some of the challenge that we have when we're taking traditional applications and thinking about a clouds-first approach to those traditional applications. So what if? Right? And you can do this today, and some of the departments here in Ottawa are doing this. You took the same approach to compute or the same approach to networking and storage that we take to compute. Virtualize it. Take a look at your network, understand what's going on, take a snapshot of it, and then swap it out. Instead of hardware, one day it becomes software, right? Same thing for storage. Look at the dependencies that your applications have on storage, take a snapshot of it, flip it. Your storage features now become software. And there's a lot of really cool things that happen there as well. I don't want to limit this just to workload migration, but from the perspective of workload migration, once everything your application depends on is just ones and zeros, those ones and zeros move really easily. I can take ones and zeros and move them into a VMware Cloud and another data center that I might have. So what if we had that sort of capability? All my traditional applications are just ones and zeros, and now I want to leverage those and give them to maybe a new digital team that I have in my department to start to build new apps on top of it, something that's going to have immediate impact to the citizens that we support. What if I could take that traditional application that you've got without spending significant money on replatforming and just move it into the Amazon data center, and now you have access to all these cloud services that let you build an application on top of it very, very quickly. And that's exactly what we've been doing. So VMware and AWS got together a couple years ago and really made this offering come together so that you can enable those things. So you have traditional applications interacting with some of these net new services to bridge the world of traditional applications and cloud native applications. And so if you look at what we deliver, you've got on the VMware side all of the capabilities that you've expected over the years to help drive those traditional applications. A lot of different workloads. I mean, everything works on VMware. That's just the reality. You don't have to think, is this going to work or not? It works on VMware. And really is the de facto standard for most enterprises, and I would say as well for the Canadian government. That's the de facto standard on what most of your applications are running. Take that and combine it with AWS consumption economics. We'll talk about some use cases later, but what if you had this traditional application, tax season, you suddenly need 3 times more workload, but only for a month? Hey, that is right in the wheelhouse of what AWS does, right? Giving you those new cloud services so you can develop new capabilities on top of your application, and potentially giving you global reach, right? Say you've got an embassy you need to enable across the pond. Absolutely not a problem if you're leveraging the AWS infrastructure. So bringing these two worlds together is really what we're talking about when we talk VMC on AWS. So some of the benefits that come in here before I hand over to Paul to talk a little bit more on the tech side. Number one, you have that SDDC, the software-defined data center services that you know and I'm hoping love, maybe not, but hope you love. They work. And you can have those delivered as a cloud service on AWS. So it is a service, you can get access to it, you can scale it up, you can scale it down, you can pay for it monthly, et cetera, right? That becomes a cloud service. You get access to the existing capabilities that you have in your organization. And this is something not to be discounted. You have tools, moderately interesting, people, very interesting, processes, incredibly interesting, that are built around this already, right? And you know that as a government organization, taking all of those people, processes, and technologies and moving them is a big effort. If you take advantage of VMware Cloud on AWS, you have all of those same processes, people, and technologies that you can leverage after you've done a cloud migration as well. Speaking of workload migrations, because it is the same platform, right? We're not talking about migrating from platform that you're on right now to a new platform in the future. It's the same platform. I want to be very clear. That's important to understand. Moving from one platform to another platform really is not much because it's the same thing between the two. So that portability is incredibly important. You get access to the power of those Amazon Web Services, which Paul will talk a little bit more about. And you have access to all of the applications. Everything runs on VMware, whether it be a traditional off-the-shelf application, something you've developed in the past, or a new container-based application that you're working on. These are the SDDC technologies you are using today, made available in the cloud. Gives you the opportunity to move towards a cloud-first model without having to spend a whole lot of time and money, those two currencies, on re-platforming what you have. And so with that, I'm going to hand over to Paul to go into a little more technical detail on the platform.
Thank you, Peter. Appreciate it. So my name is Paul Bockelman. I'm with AWS, and I've been a member of the VMware Cloud on AWS team since October of 2016, so when the joint announcement came out. And I've had the honor to be able to actually work very closely with the engineering teams in Palo Alto, in addition to our engineering teams in Seattle, to see this product come to fruition. And it's been pretty exciting. I was just looking today on the public website for the amount of features and enhancements that have actually been launched since 2016. And there's over 100, I think there's 168 features that have actually been launched since we announced in 2016 and went live later that year. And if you take a look at the roadmap, there's a really long list of things coming. And so, in the spirit of what Peter was talking about, what I want to do is I want to talk about the actual product and get into a little bit of detail insofar as how this matters for government, right? I mean, we're doing this, working with this product in the US, we're working with it in other countries. And while everybody's rules and compliance requirements may vary slightly, and there's a lot of different things that may actually come of that. The implementations actually often look the very same. And so let's get into the details a bit about it. So what is the product? So the product is a delivery of 3 core VMware technologies. You have vSphere, the NSX, and vSAN. So you have the virtualization of all 3 layers: your compute, your network, and your storage. These are delivered as a service, as a managed cloud offering by VMware on AWS Global Infrastructure. This is not nested virtualization. We get this question constantly. People, I don't know, how many times did you have it at the booth today? Probably a couple times.
Yeah.
It's a very common question. People are like, well, wait a minute, VMware has its own hypervisor. How does this whole thing work out? I'll get into a little bit more on that. And then when you take a look at what this service, you have these 3 things that are operating inside of a VMware, or actually an AWS VPC inside of an account. You have then the operational management side of it. So you have what you're doing today on-prem, you can continue to do that, and that is now extended. The ability to manage that environment from both on-prem and what's in the cloud has been extended to you, the customers. And through things like vCenter hybrid link mode, enables you to actually manage your entire, have a single pane of glass for all of your VMware-based workloads, whether they're running on-prem in your data centers or if they're running within VMware Cloud on AWS. If we take a look at the next piece of it, because you're running in an AWS region, you now have access to all of the native AWS services that are available in that region. And we mean all of the region, all of these services. Now, the specifics and the plumbing about that I'll address here in a minute. But when Peter was talking about, hey, how do we speed time to market? How do we speed time to value for our customers and get things going? First off, always the biggest the biggest hurdle to clear is, I need to get to the cloud. How can I get there quickly? And so I think Peter has done a very good job of laying out how that portability is actually enabled very quickly with an implementation of this technology. But more so, once you have workloads that are actually running in a region, in an AWS region, when you want to look at how can I start to take advantage of some of the AWS native services that are also running in that region to actually perhaps expand the capabilities or the reach of an application, you can very quickly adopt those technologies because you're running within the same region. And so when we take a look at some of the feature highlights here, a couple things to keep in mind. I talked about this not being nested virtualization. This is actually running on bare metal AWS Nitro instance family. That is what underpins the vSphere hosts. And then another key point to keep in mind here is that this is a service that's offered, sold, delivered, and managed by VMware. This is not something that you go into your AWS console and you see an icon for VMC and you launch that. That being said, what this is not is a software stack. This is not a SaaS play or a PaaS play where just VMware just came in and just dropped everything on our infrastructure and we walked away. This is a very heavily engineered, jointly engineered solution that we're working on together. And so many of those updates and enhancements that I spoke about when I started have been delivered through those joint engineering efforts. And there's definitely more in the pipeline. Really excited to see where this is going. So if we take a look at, we take a look at this product in its entirety and say, okay, we have vSphere, NSX, vSAN. It's important to keep in mind that it is now delivered as a service. This is not something where, as the administrator, where you're going to have actual access to the host. You're not going to have direct access into the hypervisor and things like that. This is a managed cloud offering that VMware is delivering to you as a customer. And the flip side of that is, because they're doing that, they're managing and maintaining the health of the environment, which includes if you have misbehaving hosts, things like that need to be replaced, they'll be replaced on your behalf without having to suffer outages or degraded performance within your environment. From a support perspective, that also means that you have a single belly button. It's a VMware solution. So you're not forced into a situation where you have to try to figure out, is this an AWS problem or is this a VMware problem? And so a single call to support, to VMware support, will help you resolve any solutions that you have. And if any of the issues that you have, if there's a need to get AWS involved because it's an infrastructure issue, VMware manages that relationship directly with AWS and works on your behalf, so you don't have to worry about who do I call. And so let's take a look at some of the strategies and some of the use cases that customers have come to us, and we've actually seen as customers have been onboarding. These are some of the common use cases, not the only ones. But if we take a look at using the service, one of the most logical ones to leap to right away is data center extension in DR. So I need more capacity. I don't want to necessarily make the investment and build out additional data center capabilities with physical hardware investment, but I need more. So having an extension in the cloud is a logical first step. But the other one is actually probably the lowest hanging fruit and very common is disaster recovery. I need to protect VMs that I have running on site, and I don't necessarily want to double the footprint of my hardware investment. I want to be able to pick and choose even with some of the service offerings. So you pick and choose which workloads you want to protect, and you actually start protecting them on a minimum size scale cluster to begin with, and then you actually just grow the cluster as you see fit or you see the need. So if we move into the next common one is consolidating or closing. This is it's a big push in the US as an example. There's government mandates for cloud first. So the central governments are being required to consolidate down into cloud-based data centers. But that's not just a US only thing. We're finding that as we travel around the world, where governments and members of government are coming and saying, listen, our funding for the data centers and actually operating the environments, that's changing the way it's going to be made available to us. We need to go to cloud. How can we get there quickly? And so this really helps out with the workload, the cloud migration story, right? So if it's a matter of we need to do some consolidations and we just need a place to be, whether that's the final resting place, if you would, or if it's a temporary location, this offering gives you the ability to make that decision and actually change your mind. That's the big thing. The thing that I really like about this product and this offering is that you don't have to commit upfront to a long-term. You're binding yourself into something very similar to the way you would if you were actually buying a hardware, making a hardware investment. You make that investment, now you got to use it. Here, you buy a cluster, you decide, I don't need the cluster anymore, you terminate it, move your data off of it. And so if we take a look at next generation applications. So Peter talked a bit about this as well. So now you have existing applications that we can do the workload migrations, but what about new ones, net new ones? We want to take advantage of some of the native capabilities that you would find in the cloud. This is a very common use case and design pattern that we see some customers are actually doing net new application adds where they want to use a lot of the native AWS services, but they're still very much a VMware shop. Now, the good thing about this is that these are not the 3 use cases that you have to choose from some menu. So there isn't a situation where I want to try VMware Cloud on AWS and I need to decide which of these use cases is the version that I'm going to buy. That's not the case. You buy the service, you subscribe to the service, cluster, you configure a cluster, instantiate it, it's up and running. You decide how you're going to use that. It's yours to decide and operate. So where is it? This list got really big as of VMworld this past year. We were doing global, or actually regional rollouts with the goal of hitting every major geo around the world, and then once we circled the globe, fill in all of the rest. And the demand actually jumped pretty significantly with this offering as it's been rolled out. And so the available regions with Oregon and Virginia, Northern Virginia were our first 2 launches. And then we moved into London and Frankfurt, and then Sydney recently launched. We have Canada is actually going to be launching the first half of next year. So we're real excited about that coming online and look forward to working with the customers as soon as that's available. But you can start working with it now in a dev test mode. I know that from a government perspective, there's sensitivity of data that has to be taken into consideration. And so in other countries where we've had customers that have similar requirements or restrictions, they have actually begun working and testing the solution, but just using non-sensitive data to really kick the tires and understand how to operate and how to plumb this solution to work within their infrastructure. Compliance. So compliance is something that we take very seriously. Now, I'm going to speak to this on two fronts, right? So as an AWS person, we're constantly being audited. We're always working to have compliance certifications and adhere to and manage multiple compliance regimes, well, many compliance regimes around the world. That's not any different when it comes to our VMware partners. When the product launched in October 2016, or actually the partnership was announced by December of that year, we actually had a dedicated VMware compliance team that was already instantiated, up and running, and pushing towards getting certifications as soon as possible, because we know government is absolutely a massive customer for us globally. And so when you look at the compliance work that's being done from an AWS perspective, there's a distinct advantage here for VMware in that as AWS is achieving the certifications on the infrastructure, they're able to inherit those controls, inherit those certifications, and now the certification and the compliance work that needs to be done is for their stack that's running on top of an already accredited infrastructure. And so we're getting to a point now where we can quickly deliver the certifications at the AWS level, and then it's just a matter of prioritizing, really, within VMware as to how quickly they want, they can get their teams to be able to take on the different compliance regimes around the world. So if we take a look at the previous list of the launches by regions, that's an awful lot of compliance certifications that are going to have to be taken care of here shortly. So let's get into the tech here. Let's peel back the onion a little bit. So I talked about conceptually what the service is, but what's the actual implementation? That's what people always want to know. It's how do I get this thing wired up? And so when we take a look at the characteristics of the environment, I talked about it being a virtualization of the compute, the network, and the storage. So keep in mind that it's on demand. You're running on AWS, so there's a minimum cluster size of 3 now. It was reduced from 4, but it's on demand. So if you need to expand your cluster to 6 nodes or 10 nodes or 12 nodes, you can do that. It's on demand. It's being delivered to you on demand. It's literally an API call to add additional compute infrastructure into your SDDC cluster. And the opposite is true. If you need to evacuate the nodes and shrink the size of the cluster, you can do that as well. Because it's a managed cloud offering from VMware, you're always going to have the latest software. And oh, by the way, managing that software is not something that you have to do. That's part of the offering. So hypervisor upgrades, the pain associated with that, traditionally, it's not been a pleasant thing or something that people want to run into or rush into very quickly. This is managed for you. And I mentioned a little bit ago that as part of the offering, that if when we're talking about support, if a host were to be degraded and go offline, what happens? Well, it automatically gets replaced for you. Well, when you're talking about latest software, the process involves VMware making sure that your capacity that you have subscribed to, you stay at that level. So if you have subscribed to a 4-node cluster and there's going to be a maintenance event, they make sure you always have 4 nodes available to you, even if that means adding a node into the cluster to perform the maintenance and then take it out. So you're not going to feel this dip and this degradation of your services that you have to plan around. Dynamic capacity. This one's actually pretty exciting. So you get the elasticity of being in the cloud, but some recent releases that have occurred, when you're talking about DRS. And now there's a new feature called Elastic DRS. So who's familiar here on AWS side of auto-scaling, right? Familiar with the concept of auto-scaling? So think of Elastic DRS as being auto-scaling, but at an SDDC level. Very cool feature being added on. And that's continuing to expand around that capability, around managing the resources there. So if we take a look at the hardware that we're talking about, one thing that I mentioned before is that this is not nested virtualization. But I failed to mention, or at least to emphasize the point that this bare metal compute environment is single tenant. So the cluster that, as a customer, you subscribe to is yours. You're not sharing it with anyone, no other organizations. So it's dedicated, and I'll get into a little bit more about how we actually do that, how we enforce that here in a minute. But from a compute perspective, it's bare metal, approximately 72 vCPUs, so we have 36 physical cores, 512 gig of RAM, and 15 terabytes of raw NVMe flash-based storage per host. So you have a minimum host size of 3 for the cluster now. Originally, when we launched the service, it was 4. So we have very capable machines here. And networking, 25 gigabit network interface, network adapters that you can have flows up to, that can get, depending what you're connecting to, you have full access to 25 gigabit ENA. And so when we look at the hypervisor, this is the ESX, right? So whatever the latest ESX hypervisor is, that's going to be managed and delivered to you as a customer and deployed as part of your SDDC. So I made mention of this before. It's maintained by VMware because it's a managed cloud offering. So as a result, you're not going to have access to SSH or have any root access into the hypervisor. You don't get that visibility. At first, there was kind of some pushback. Customers, well, wait, hold on a second. I need to have access to that. Well, sure, you need to have access to it, but that's if you're managing and operating the actual physical infrastructure and hosts, but you're not. This allows VMware to be able to maintain a consistent level of quality in its delivery of this service. When you look at VIBs, having VIBs or any custom plugins, again, if there's a maintenance event and a customer were allowed to have plugins and VIBs plugged into the hypervisor, now we have a very precarious situation we find ourselves in. And so we've been working very closely since the launch with the ISV partner community around taking the products that they have delivered that run traditionally inside of VMware, and if they were something that required access to the hypervisor directly, or they were VIBs or plugins, working to have that software updated in the security and permissions models around that to be able to operate absent having this access. And the community's responded very well, actually. There's been a significant uptick in the amount of partners who have actually been able to support this. And I do have a typo on here. It says 4 to 32 node host cluster. It's actually 3 now. That has changed. So we talk about storage. The storage is delivered to you is vSAN that is using NVMe-backed flash storage that is on each of the host nodes that I talked about before. So we have very highly performant storage that's being made available to the cluster. One of the things to keep in mind is that if you want to scale storage, you're going to be scaling compute at the same time. The good news is in preview mode, and as announced at VMworld, is that there's vSAN is going to be EBS backed. So there will, in the future, it's in preview mode now, the ability to decouple storage and compute, so you can actually scale them independent of one another. So we look at the networking, we have NSX. NSX is your logical overlay network. Now keep in mind, you're running inside of AWS, so your underlay network is going to be VPC. And so that opens up a lot of doors for other capabilities. In fact, the ability to have an elastic environment, to be able to scale, to enable things like features like elastic DRS, is because you're running inside of the API-driven architecture or infrastructure within AWS. And so NSX currently will provide the north and southbound firewalling. In preview, it's been announced, is the microsegmentation capabilities. That is coming. It's in preview at the moment. So we have as NSX continues to add features and capabilities, those features and capabilities and enhancements are being deployed and delivered out into the AWS ecosystem through VMware Cloud. And so vSphere, again, it's managed for you. That being said, you do have delegated permissions. So once the cluster is up and running, you can actually control creating things like virtual networks. You are controlling the workload placement, how you want to actually control access to the environment through your firewalling, all of that. You have full control of that as a customer. So let's take a look at the next piece of it. And that is, it's important for you to understand the account structure here. Because I'm going to get into a design pattern that's going to be very busy. It's going to have a lot of boxes, but it usually helps customers, once they see it and visualize it, like, now I get it. Now I understand how to wire this thing up. But there's a key concept here that I'll refer to that I want to make sure that everybody's aware of. There are two accounts at play. When I'm talking about an account, it's an AWS account. So because we're talking about single tenant infrastructure that's being deployed, you have single tenant hosts. They are in single tenant AWS accounts. But those AWS accounts are owned and operated by VMware on behalf of you as a customer. Remember, it's a managed cloud offering. So they're delivering that service to you. But when you think about this from a compliance perspective and a security perspective, when you launch that SDDC cluster, it's inside of an account that is only for your organization. And the hosts that are up and operational in that is only for your organization. Now, the thing to keep in mind here is that all of the infrastructure required to deliver that capability, VMware is paying the bill. There's not a separate AWS bill for the SDDC account. When you subscribe to the service through VMware, that is all included in the subscription rate, which includes the infrastructure. The second account is what we call an AWS customer-owned account. It's an account that you guys have, you may or may not have today. It's just a standard account. But when you launch an SDDC cluster, it's required that they both exist, and there's a couple reasons for that. One is, if a customer is seeking to launch a native AWS service, so if you want to use EFS as an example, or you want to run RDS, the relational database service, that is not something you put a support ticket into VMware and say, can you launch me an RDS instance inside the cluster? That's not what they do. That's not their offering. So what we want to do is maintain a demarc between the two environments and give the customers full control over adding services, consuming native AWS services, changing the architecture of their environment whenever they feel like doing it without having to put support tickets in. And so in the example here, when we have the customer-owned account, if you decide that you want to actually launch elastic load balancers and have those receive the traffic from the internet and then forward the traffic into the SDDC, you make that decision. You don't have to put a support ticket in to get that capability. Now, one thing to keep in mind, because it's a customer-owned account, you also own any of the fees and charges incurred in using any of the services in there. So your bill that you get today, you'll still continue to get that bill. Now, how do you access it? And there's two things here that you want to know. So there is a portal. It's a VMware-based portal, vmc.vmware.com. This is a portal that there's a couple key things that you're going to do. So signing up for the service within a region, you're going to do it through this portal. Adding, removing hosts from a cluster, you're going to do it through this portal, or you can use the APIs as well. And so things like firewall configuring. Now, remember, you have two different accounts, right? So you don't have the ability in the VMware-controlled account to directly request an elastic IP and then associate it to a host. Remember, it's a managed offering. So those API calls are being done for you through this. So when you log into this portal and you want to actually add a host, that API call is being made on your behalf within the VMware managed account to an AWS endpoint to add the host, to add the cluster. So this is a very important piece of the operational picture when it comes to what VMware Cloud is and how you operate it. Next, you have the vSphere, the H5 web client for vCenter, for managing that environment. And so taking care of your networks, your virtual machine administration, it's the same tooling that you would use for on-premise. This you have access to. Now, there's multiple ways to get access to it. By default, it's denied. But then you can open that up either through an elastic IP address to this infrastructure, secured and locked down, or you can run it over a VPN. there are ways to actually manage that piece. And so let's take a look at all of these pieces. I gave you a whole bunch of different stuff, a lot of abstract things. Let's wire them together and take a look at it. So as a customer, when you sign up for the service and you build a cluster, this is what the base topology looks like, what gets built behind the scenes. So I'm going to build it out here, but at a minimum, this is the infrastructure that gets deployed into the VMware managed account. Now, if you'll notice at the bottom, we have EC2 instances. In this case, I built a cluster of 4 nodes, but your minimum is 3. Those are our Nitro-based EC2 instances. That's the bare metal offering. The difference is the ESX hypervisor is inserted on top of it, and the cluster is built, and the software stack is built on top of that. The underlay network here is VPC. That is your underlay network. When you look at vCenter, there's an instance of vCenter that is stood up, and then there are compute gateways. There are 2 compute gateways that are deployed for you. There's a management gateway for managing the environment, and then there's the compute gateway, which allows you to communicate to the outside world. And in this case, the outside world can actually be your customer-owned account. So let's take a look at that. So you have your AWS customer-owned account. You have a VPC. So as part of the provisioning process, part of the inputs are what region you want to build an SDDC cluster, how many nodes, what is the account, the AWS account that you're going to connect this to. And then you put that information in, and AWS and VMware will exchange information, and VMware will request permission on behalf, the customer authorizes VMware to essentially plant, I don't know if you can see it in there, there's a network interface. There's a network interface that gets deployed into your customer account. It gets deployed onto a subnet that you designate and into an account that you designate. So this doesn't have to be a net new customer account. It could be one that you have. If you have an existing environment, you pick the VPC, you pick the subnet, and you start to really lay out your topology here, and you have control over it. Now, what does that do for you? Well, a couple things. One is this is bridging the overlay network on the left-hand side of the screen with the VPC in your customer account on the right-hand side, which theoretically could be an underlay network. So it allows you to route traffic between the two, and allows you to consume services from the left-hand side to the right and vice versa. You can have native AWS services that want to consume offerings that are being run inside of the cluster. And so then you have your customer data center. So you have your environment. It could be a data center, it could be a closet, it could be another SDDC cluster, it could be defined however you want. But there's a very basic line that's drawn here that represents connectivity between the customer data center and the SDDC cluster. That's a gross oversimplification. I'll put that out there. There's a lot of options there. There's VPN, it's VPN connected, or we actually even offer and support routing over direct connect using private VIFs, private virtual interfaces. So that can be a very robust connectivity solution. And also that line can also extend over to your customer gateway or to your customer VPC. So let's build this out real quick and take a look at if we had a sample application stacks. So in your traditional environment, Peter talked about 3-tier application architecture, right? We have a web front end, we have a reverse web proxy. It could be a couple different things. It could be load balancers, whatever you want in front of it. We have an application stack, and we have databases all living within the SDDC cluster. And so if we're looking at a hybrid infrastructure here, and we say, okay, well, let's try to make this a little more hybrid. And say, well, for application 2, we want to scale it horizontally because perhaps we have cyclical demand that's coming, and we need to actually increase the amount of compute capacity that we have to deliver an application. Tax season is an example. But if we're going to horizontally scale the front-end application, we should scale the back end. And so in this example, we scaled the front end by, in this example here, I put an NFS-backed storage gateway into the SDDC cluster, which the actual storage was S3. File system was S3. Just presented that to the web cluster and made shared file system available to it. This is not the only way to do it. There's probably a dozen other ways that you could do it. This is just an example. But if you'll notice on the right-hand side, what appeared is an RDS cluster, an Aurora RDS environment that actually connected in. And the data, and in this example, this example was actually a live, built, and operational environment that we've run for the last couple of years at both VMworld and reInvent. You have this Aurora cluster environment that's up and running, and now you have communication happening where all your data is residing inside of your customer account, and then you have your application front ends living in the SDDC cluster. And so if we were to build this out a little bit further, we could say, well, maybe we want to aggregate all of the traffic that's coming into the clusters. We want to run it through a single managed service. So you could optionally roll your own if you're looking to do firewalls or load balancers and run those as virtual appliances, or you can just subscribe to native AWS service, Elastic Load Balancer service as an example. You want to get out of the business of managing that piece of it. You don't want to deal with the scaling issues associated with that. So on the right-hand side of the screen here, you'll notice we dropped an ELB in, and we're starting to forward the traffic from external. Now, I actually have a presentation that I did where I could have spoken for about 2 hours on just this architecture. This is an oversimplification of what you can do in terms of a hybrid architecture. I mean, if you look at the right-hand side, when you start integrating things like Route 53 or CloudFront, now you're starting to talk about how do we augment the security posture of the applications that are running inside of the cloud. You know, do we protect our web applications with CloudFront, WAF, load balancers, Shield, all of those offerings? Those are all now fully enabled, both for the VMware offering as well as for the native offering that's inside of AWS. This information here is, you know, if you peel out all of the virtual machines and all of the different blocks that we dropped in there, this is your SDDC architecture. It's simple. It's meant to be simple because we want to be able to make it easy for you to be able to consume it. When we look at onboarding customers and we say, where's the amount of work that you have to actually put in that you're trying to dig down into getting this working, it's a connectivity between your data center and the SDDC cluster. Once that connectivity is up and running, things like vMotion are available. Things like vCenter operating in hybrid link mode. You can operate the cloud environment from on-prem and vice versa. So I present this to you just as a representation of, yeah, there's a lot of lines, but it can actually be a simple thing. Pretty easy way to on-ramp. Peter. And I'm going to wrap up here by putting up, there's some more information out there. I highly recommend you actually go out and visit the product information pages, particularly the second URL there for roadmap. This is an active roadmap. It's a live roadmap. So things that are being developed, things that are in preview, even things that are planned, all fully published. So you'll have a very good insight as to what's coming down the line. We look forward to seeing the region offering launching here in Canada, first half of 19, and hopefully to see more of your faces in the future. Thank you. Appreciate your time.
All right. Thank you very much, Paul. So I just wanted to wrap that up a little bit, tie it back to where I started. Somebody said to me in the other room, Canada's about 5 years behind on some of this stuff. Okay, I can accept that. However, like I said earlier, the toolkit you have to catch up and even leapfrog your peers elsewhere in the world is huge, right? You think a few years ago, someone in a US government agency could say, I have this application I want to take to the cloud. Can you get it for me there in a couple weeks? You think the answer was yes? Absolutely not. That's the answer we can have, right, if we're having a conversation with you. If you want to migrate something, we got tools that'll migrate for you. If you want to have something operate in on-prem and in a cloud mode and communicate back and forth, we can do that for you. These are things that were roadblocks for people who started before that are not roadblocks for you. So when you're looking to accelerate your time to market, be proud of the fact that you're starting now when you have a toolbox that your peers could only have imagined 5 years ago.
Yeah, for sure.
And go and change the world and change Canada for us. Thanks very much. We'll see a VMware booth maybe in the other room is where we can take questions. You get extra time if you bring me a beer. All right. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.